Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. We move forward with our discussion of the ecology of changes, and today we will have a look at the impacts of plastics. Now, in the last lecture we had seen that the impacts of disturbances depends on the kind of disturbance, how large it is, and also the status of the community. If you have a normal community, you give it a large infrequent disturbance, so the status moves from normal to an altered status, but then slowly with time it comes back to the normal status again. So, it tells us that this is a resilient community. On the other hand, if you give it more than one large infrequent disturbances, so you have this normal community, you gave it a disturbance, it became an altered community, then it was trying to come back to the normalcy, but you gave it another disturbance and it becomes an altered community for a very long time. So, it is not able to cope back. And the third instance was, if you have a community that is not a normal community, but is already suffering some amount of stress or some amount of alterations, and you give it a disturbance and it is not able to cope up again. Now, in today's lecture we will have a look at such communities. Now, if you have a biological community and there is an influx of plastics into this community, so it is possible that the organisms become stressed and they are not able to reach their full potential, and that exacerbates the impact of any other disturbance that the community might face. So, we begin with the definition of plastics. So, plastic is a synthetic material made from a wide range of organic polymers such as polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride, nylon, etc., that can be molded into shape when soft and then set into a rigid or slightly elastic form. So, we know plastics because plastics surround us. So, we find plastics everywhere, even in this room, even in the room you are sitting in, you will observe a number of plastic items, starting from your pens or to components in your computers, to maybe chairs, to maybe buttons in your dresses and so on. So, plastics surround us, and so it becomes important to understand the impacts that plastics may have on different communities and ecosystems. So, we will look at a short history of plastics. So, the earliest use of plastics began in 1600 BC, where Mesoamericans were processing natural rubber into a plastic. So, they were converting natural rubber into balls and they used to play with these balls. So, that is the earliest known usage of a plastic material. Now, in the 19th century, we started seeing plastics in a bigger way. In the 19th century, polystyrene and polyvinyl chloride were invented. Then in the 20th century, in 1909, bakelite was used in commercial products. By 1926, PVC was commercialized, then sarin was invented, then polyurethane foam got invented, then Teflon was invented, nylon and neoprene got invented. So, we are seeing that all these plastics, most of the plastics that are surrounding us were actually invented in the 20th century. Then we had the emergence of polyethylene terephthalate and polyesters. Now, PET is something that is there in all the plastic bottles that we are using, especially the disposable water bottles. They are all made of polyethylene terephthalate, PET. Then during World War II, as metals became more and more scarce, so plastics were widely manufactured to replace them. So, this got a major boost during the World War II, and then this boost continued. So, in 1951, high density polyethylene and polypropylene got invented. 1954, you had the invention of styrofoam. So, once styrofoam was made out of polystyrene, so now it became available for a number of packaging applications. And by 1979, the plastic production in the US started to exceed the steel production, and this has continued since then. And in fact, every year we see that the amount of plastics that are produced is more than what was produced in the last year. So, the plastic production is increasing at the rate of 5% per annum. Now, what what happens to all of these plastics? Everything has a shelf life, everything has a usable life. If you are using a plastic pen, after its life is done, you throw it down in the dustbin. But then what happens to this plastic pen after it has been thrown into the dustbin? Does it get recycled? Does it get reused? Because a big property of plastics is that a number of biological entities are not able to act on it. So, for instance, if you have an item that is made out of wood, and after its usage when you throw it down, so there would be a number of decomposers that would act on this wood and then break it down. Once that is broken down, so the elements get released back into the ecosystem. But in the case of plastics, because these are man-made materials and because a number of organisms do not have proper enzymes to cut these plastics, so they have a tendency to remain in the system. So, organisms will not be able to digest these plastics. The only way that is left out is that we should be able to recover these plastics and maybe remold them into some other item. But then if we look at how much of these plastics has ever been recovered, we see that it is a very minuscule fraction of what was produced. So, it is like hardly 4 or 5% or less than 10% of plastics that has ever been produced has been recovered. So, if we are not able to recover these plastics, if we are not able to recycle them, where do these plastics go? So, as we have seen, the reused and recycled portion forms a very small fraction of the total amount of plastics that is being produced. So, for the rest of the plastics, there are instances where people try to burn them off, because you have a heavy amount or a large amount of plastics. By burning them, you can at least convert some of its hydrocarbons into gases, so that they get released and your amount of the waste gets reduced. So, in place of having a very huge volume of plastics that you will have as part of a waste material, when you burn it down, so most of the gases would be released and then it will be shrink down to a very small fraction, which can then be put into a landfill. But then it has been observed that when you burn plastics, you release dioxins, which are extremely toxic compounds, and you also release carbon dioxide. Or in most of our cities, these plastics go into the landfills. Now, if you put plastics into a landfill, they are going to remain there for hundreds or even thousands of years, and we are running short of space for landfills. Or if you are not able to burn these plastics, if you are not able to reuse and recycle them, if you are not putting it into a landfill, or even if you are putting it into a landfill and there is some rain and some amount of these plastics get washed down, ultimately they reach the environment. When they reach the environment, they reach the terrestrial environment and also the marine environment. Now, when we talk about release into the terrestrial environment, so you can have plastics that are reaching into your forests, you have plastics that are reaching into the croplands, and there are a number of animals that are getting exposed to these plastics. On the other hand, when the plastics get washed down, they can move from small streams into larger streams, into rivers, and ultimately they reach into the oceans, and then the plastics are then exposed to the marine organisms. So, both terrestrial ecosystems and the marine ecosystems are these days getting exposed to these plastics. So, it becomes important to know what is the impact of these plastics on these ecosystems, and even more so in the case of the marine ecosystems, because ultimately these plastics are going to reach into the marine ecosystems. So, what happens when plastics reach the seas or the oceans? The fate of the marine plastics is this: 15% keep floating on the surface, 15% get washed ashore, so they reach the beaches and the shores, and 70% sink to the ocean bottom. So, what happens to this 70%? This 70% is now exposing itself to the benthic organisms, to the benthic ecosystems or the bottom dwellers, to the crabs for instance, to the starfishes for instance. The 15% that remain floating on the surface, they are being exposed to the sun, they are being exposed to air, so they might break down into smaller portions, or otherwise they might get picked up by fishes that are they might get picked up by birds that are looking out for fishes, because these look like a fish that has come to the surface. So, a bird might not be able to distinguish whether it is a piece of plastic that is floating on the surface or whether it is a fish that has come to the surface. So, a bird might pick it up, and if it gets washed ashore, so in that case a number of organisms that live on the beaches will get exposed to these plastics. So, we have 15% floating on the surface, 15% washed ashore, and 70% that is sinking to the ocean bottoms. So, how does that look like? This is what plastic looks like when it is floating on the surface. So, these are all waste materials that have been released into the environment and they have reached into a water body, and because like this bottle it has lots of air inside, or this doll it has a lot of air inside, so it is less dense than water, and so it is floating on the surface of water. Or else when it gets washed ashore, so here we are observing the example of a hermit crab. So, we had seen this example when we were talking about the ecological interactions, the positive interactions, where we had seen that a hermit crab is an organism that is very easily predated upon by a number of predators. So, to protect itself it uses the shells of other organisms. So, it uses the shells of mollusks, and so if there is a shell that is available, so this hermit crab would try to squeeze itself inside that shell, and it would carry that shell along with its body, so that it forms a protective cover. Now, in this example we are observing that in this deplorable state of affairs, this hermit crab is using the cap of a bottle as its outer shell. So, we are observing changes in the behaviors of organisms. Or when it reaches into the seabeds, so here we are observing a number of plastics that are there on the seabeds. You have these bottles, you have some bags and so on, and the organisms that are living on the seabed are now getting exposed to these plastics. Now, when we are talking about plastics, so all these plastics are of different shapes and sizes. You have some large pieces of plastic, you have some smaller pieces of plastics, and in the case of this bottle cap, we can observe that it is already in a degraded state. So, some parts of it have come out, they have become chipped out. So, when looking at the impacts of these plastics, we classify these debris into three categories. The first category is known as the macro debris. Macro is large size. So, macro debris is a debris that is greater than 20 millimeters or 2 centimeters in size. So, when we are talking about this bottle, so this bottle is greater than 2 centimeters in size. So, this is a part of a macro debris, and in this case ghost nets are the main concern. So, we will look at ghost nets in more detail in a short while. The second category is a meso debris. Meso is in between. So, 5 to 20 millimeters in size, they are meso debris, and these are dominated by nurdles, which are resin granules that are intermediates in plastic production. Now, how are plastics made? So, you take out petroleum, you make chemicals out of it, then you polymerize those chemicals so that you have the basic building blocks of plastic. Now, those basic building blocks are then made in the form of small granules, so that it becomes easy to transport, and so that you can take this plastic from the place it was manufactured to the place where it should be casted into some other useful shapes. So, you will have small particles, small granules that will be taken from one place to the other place, and these particles are known as nurdles. Now, in the factory where the items are being manufactured, so in the factory where this pen was manufactured, these nurdles will be taken, they will be heated. So, when they are heated, they become soft, they become liquefied, and then it is casted into this shape. So, those are nurdles. Now, nurdles, because of their small size, they are classified as meso debris. Now, why should nurdles become debris? Suppose there is a ship that is carrying nurdles from one country to another country. So, there is one country that is making the polymers, then it converts it into nurdles, and then it is shipping it to another country that will then use these nurdles to make items of use. And suppose this ship capsizes, or maybe a few boxes of nurdles become capsized out into the oceans. So, these nurdles have now come out into the environment. Otherwise also, if there is a factory that is using these nurdles to make say pens, so some amount of nurdles may get released during the normal process of production. So, all these nurdles when they reach into the environment, they are classified as meso debris. And the third thing is known as micro debris. Micro is small. So, micro debris is something that is less than 5 millimeters in size, and they are often formed through fragmentation of macro or meso debris. So, if you have a large sized particle or a large sized debris and it is getting broken down, so it will form a micro debris. And they also consist of plastic scrubber particles as are found in face wash and other cosmetic products. Now, when we are talking about the formation of the micro debris, because in a number of situations micro debris play a very big role in the ecosystems. Why? Because say you have a pen that is floating on the surface of water. Now, there could be a few birds that would identify this as food and try to pick it up and try to feed on it, but then that number will only remain limited to a few organisms or a few species of organisms. Whereas, when we are talking about micro debris, they are so small that a number of organisms that are there in the ocean will get exposed to these small particles. So, even when they are looking out for food, these particles might get ingested along with the food, or in the case of fishes that are using gills for their respiration, these small particles might get inside and get lodged into the gills of these organisms. Even in the case of planktons, these micro particles, these micro debris can get eaten up by these planktons and reach into the food chain. So, micro debris become extremely important when we are analyzing the impacts of plastics on the ecosystem. So, how do these micro debris form? So, the production of smaller fragments or the production of micro debris or even meso debris from macro debris and meso debris, it occurs like this. So, you have synthetic polymers that have stabilizers, fillers, extenders and other additives, and when they are out in the environment, so they are acted upon by the UV light. So, here you have HU, that is photons. So, it is being acted upon by light, then it is acted upon by oxygen. So, there is some amount of oxidation reactions that are going on, then they are also acted upon by microbes and worms. Now, when they are acted upon by these agents, so we have processes of light absorption, photolytic reaction. Now, photo is light, lysis is breakdown. So, this is a breakdown reaction that occurs because of light. So, you have photolytic reactions, you have formation of radicals, and you have enzymatic degradation that then results in oxidation and scission. Now, oxidation we know is the action of oxygen or addition of oxygen, and scission is a breakdown reaction or a cutting reaction. So, you have a scission reaction that causes discoloration, loss of mechanical integrity, strength and impact properties. So, essentially what we are saying here is that if you consider a plastic, so suppose you are considering this plastic bottle, and if I press this plastic bottle, it will be able to come back to its original size because there is some amount of elasticity in this material. But then if I leave this plastic out there in the sun for some time, so you will observe that this transparent plastic starts getting whitish in color. Now, when we are seeing that it is changing color, it means that there are some chemical reactions that are going on. Once it becomes whitish in color, it also becomes brittle. So, if you press that again, so in that case it will convert itself into a powdery substance, and this is what we are talking about here. So, we have all these reactions that are causing discoloration, loss of mechanical integrity, strength and impact properties. So, now if two plastic particles collide against each other, two debris particles collide with each other, or suppose you have this plastic that is going and colliding with a rock. So, in that case this will start breaking off, small pieces will start chipping out, and if those small pieces are less than 5 millimeters in size, then we will say that these are micro debris. And we see examples of these everywhere. So, now if we talk about a decomposing debris, here you have a polythene sheet, and in this case you have this film and small fibers that are now coming out because of the process of the decomposition. Now mind you, when we are talking about decomposition, this is different from the decomposition that we observe in the ecosystems, because in that case any material gets decomposed completely so that it becomes the nutrients which are then taken up again by the food webs. But in this case, when you are converting your plastic into a smaller fragment, this smaller fragment is not a part of the nutrition cycle anywhere. So, it is not taken up by any of the organisms for food, or at least it is not voluntarily taken up by any organism for food, and it cannot be used as a food. Even if it gets into the bodies of some organisms, it is only going to create a blockage, it will not provide nutrition to the organism. Now, if you look at any pond or most of the water bodies, we will observe things like this small piece of film. Now, here we have this size. So, this is 1 millimeter. So, this piece of film that is floating around, this is a micro debris. You can even have some pellets or beads. So, you can have nurdles, or you can even have some pellets that are coming out of the cosmetic products such as face washes. So, they are used as scrubbers in face washes, and they might also come out. You can even have fragments that are made out of foam. So, when we are talking about styrofoam, when we are talking about thermocol, small pieces might come out. So, they will have the property of a foam, but then they are also very small in size. Or you can have these fibers. So, this is a line that is made out of plastic. Now, not only do you have this process of decomposition that will happen, but at the same time we might also have the process of aggregation. Now, in the process of decomposition, we were moving from macro debris to meso debris to micro debris. Now, in the process of aggregation, you can have situation in which the micro debris becomes associated with each other. So, it joins together with other particles of micro debris and becomes a meso debris. Now, examples include the feces of a number of organisms. So, probably there was an animal that was having these micro debris in its environment, and it was able to eat these micro debris, and so these micro debris were able to reach the intestines. Now, in the intestines the food gets absorbed, but the plastics do not get absorbed, they are not decomposed there. And then after a while, when it is giving out the feces, so in this feces you have all of these small particles that are now together. So, this might convert from a micro debris to a meso debris, or it might even convert itself into a marine snow. Now, marine snow refers to a number of particles or fragments or dead bodies of organisms that move in a top down manner in the ocean systems. So, let us consider a column of the ocean. So, here we have the seabed, and here we have the ocean surface. Now, near the ocean surface we have a number of planktons. So, we have phytoplanktons and zooplanktons. Now, these planktons, they are using sunlight and they are doing photosynthesis. They also get eaten up by the zooplanktons and maybe even by the larger size fishes. Now, when they die out, or maybe there was a fish in the water and it was predated upon, and probably this small fragment of the fish remained. Now, such fragments, the dead bodies of the organisms or the fragments of these organisms, or maybe pieces of feces that are there in the organisms, they, because they are they have a greater density than that of water, they start coming down. Now, they will come down in a process that will take number of years, because they are very small sized particles, and they take a very long time to come down because of the effects of viscosity, and also because because of buoyancy. Now, in this case, these particles, when they are coming down, they are known as marine snow. Now, in this case, what we are saying is that these fecal particles, which have so many plastic particles inside, they might get connected with each other and they might start going down. Or else, if there is already existing particle of the marine snow, you can have some plastics that come and aggregate with these, and then also they start coming down. So, in this process, what we are observing is that in the case of a small piece of micro debris, it might remain on the top surface of the oceans, but then because it is able to associate with already existing particles and with the feces of organisms, so it is also able to reach down. So, even the microplastics or the micro debris are able to reach to the bottom of the oceans. Now, if we talk about all of these debris, if we talk about macro, meso and micro debris, how does that impact the ecosystem? That is what we are interested in knowing. So, there is a plastic, if it does not play any role in the ecosystem, we are okay with it, but then if it impacts the ecosystem in a negative manner, then we have to be extremely wary of it. So, how does it impact the ecosystem? So, there are a number of things that happen. First is ingestion. Ingestion is eating. Now, if you look at these plastic bags, now these are all polythene bags, and they are put into water, and now we can see that these are polythene bags because we can see these handles, but then to an animal that is living in the water, they might look like jellyfishes, and so these animals might try to eat these plastic bags. So, in that way the plastics are getting eaten up by the animals. Or let us say in the oceans, so you have say a small piece of plastic, say the cap of a pen, that is floating here. So, you might have a bird that may mistake it for a fish that has come to the surface and might try to pick it up. Now, here we have the situation of an albatross. Now, albatrosses are very large sized birds and they are very long lived birds. They live for as long as 50 or 60 years. Now, in this case what happened was, this is an albatross chick, a dead albatross chick, and in this case the parents, because the chick is growing, so it has a huge amount of nutritional requirements. Now, a chick cannot go out and catch birds and catch fishes for itself. So, the parents need to go out. So, the parents went out, and the parents, when they saw these plastic pieces that were floating on the surface of water, they mistook it for fishes, and then they dutifully brought all of these pieces to the chick, and then they fed their chick with all these plastic pieces. What happens later? These plastic pieces then block the alimentary canal of the chick, so it is not able to gain any more nutrition, and then it dies out of malnutrition. And here also we can observe that the whole body of the chick is getting decomposed, but then these plastics remain, and then these plastics after the next rains will again go back into the oceans and then might be picked up by another albatross. Now, this is how the plastics result in a havoc when they get eaten up by organisms, and we see these plastics getting eaten up at all stages. So, this is an example of a sea pen polyp. So, these are small marine animals that normally live on the seabeds, and here we can observe that if we see the mouth area of this polyp, there is this small fiber that is made out of plastic. Now, you can see that this is the scale bar. So, this is 200 microns. So, the complete length of this fiber is say around 1 millimeter. The complete length of this fiber is 1 millimeter, and this is a plastic fiber that has gone, and that can be seen in the mouth of a sea pen polyp. So, we are seeing that not only are large pieces getting eaten up by birds, but also the very small pieces, the fibers that are being eaten up by the polyps, and nobody is left out, even in the case of the planktons. Now, planktons are microscopic organisms, but then if you look at planktons, you will observe that even their bodies will have plastics inside. Now, this was these images were taken using fluorescent microscopes, in which the plastic particles are showing up in green. So, here you can see that this is a zooplankton, and it has a plastic piece here, a plastic piece here. In this another zooplankton, you have a plastic here, you have a plastic here, and similarly this is say a larva of some organism. It is also a very small organism, and you are seeing plastics everywhere. You even see things like your microplastic beads that are there in the alimentary canal. they are also coming out in the feces. So, this is a feces of a zooplankton, and we are seeing these microparticles of plastics inside. So, nobody is left out. Now, if even the planktons are having plastics in their bodies, and when planktons get eaten up by other organisms, when they get eaten up by small fishes, then larger fishes, and then by birds and so on. So, we see that these microplastics are now able to move throughout the food chain, from the very bottom to the very top. Even the apex predators might be having some plastics in their bodies now. It has a very large role in bottom dwellers and filter feeders. Now, when we were talking about the organisms that live on the floats of the oceans, when we are talking about the benthic organisms, so there are a number of organisms that are filter feeders. Now, what is a filter feeder? So, like if this organism is a filter feeder, it would try to get a large amount of water into its body, and then there would be a filter like system in its body, so that all the planktons get filtered and those planktons are then eaten and digested. Now, if you have microplastics that are of the size of these planktons, then all of these plastics are also getting into the body, then they are getting filtered out, and then they are blocking the alimentary canal of these filter feeders. And these plastics may get captured into various body parts of these organisms, or maybe when there are some organisms that are burrowing a hole into the seabed, so they also get incorporated into the burrowed walls of the system. So, these plastics are not just floating on the top surface of the ocean, they are able to move down along with the feces, along with the marine snow, and even when they are down, they are influencing the organisms that are a part of the ocean ecosystem, and they are even able to get down into the seabed with these organisms. So, here we can see that there is a huge impact on the wild organisms or on the ecosystems. So, the first one is ingestion, the second one is entanglement or even smothering of the animals. So, we were talking about the ghost nets. Now, this is a ghost net. Now, in the case of a ghost net, it was earlier a fishing net that was being used maybe in some ship, and probably at the end of its useful life it got torn up, or maybe the ship capsized, or maybe this was just left out by accident. And now, if you have this net that is floating in the water, it is still capturing animals. So, animals get caught up in these nets. There is no person who is using these nets, but animals are still getting caught. Now, once you have an animal that gets caught here, so now this animal is unable to move. In the case of these tortoises, they are reptiles and they require air for respiration. So, even the sea turtles, they have to surface once in a while to gather their breath. Now, if they get entangled in one such net, they will not be able to reach to the surface, and they will die out of a lack of oxygen, they will die out of asphyxiation. Or probably if there is an organism that gets caught here, and this organism is not able to now move out to catch its prey, to get its food, so it will die out of malnutrition. So, entanglement is also a big way in which these plastics, now most of these nets are made out of nylon. So, this is one big way in which nylon is impacting the wildlife. Or there could be situations in which there is an animal, and this animal is now getting trapped in one of these plastic pieces. So, there is this plastic band which is now cutting through the skin of the seal. Now, in this case, probably the animal got this piece of plastic when it was small, and now this animal is growing in size with time, but then the plastic is not allowing it to grow. So, it is actually cutting through its skin. Now, this organism will be exposed to a number of infections, and in this particular case, this animal actually died out. It could not be saved because of this plastic. Now, besides ingestion and entanglement, there are also a number of persistent bioaccumulative toxic substances that are there in the plastics. Now, persistent means that these chemicals will remain in the system for a very long time. They are very difficult to degrade. So, microorganisms or other organisms will not be able to break them down into non-toxic substances. there are a number of chemicals that are bioaccumulative. Now, bioaccumulative, as we have seen, is the case in which there is a chemical that is getting absorbed into the body, and then the body is also trying to degrade it and to flush it out of the system. But then if the rate of absorption is greater than the rate at which it can be thrown out of the body, then it starts getting accumulated in the body. So, persistent toxic substances and bioaccumulative toxic substances, these are also there in the plastics. Now, you might ask this question, why would somebody want to put a toxin in a plastic? Well, people do not want to put a toxin in a plastic, but then a number of substances that are used to make this plastic more and more supple might actually be toxic substances. So, we have things that are known as plasticizers. A number of plasticizers are toxic substances, or you could even have a situation in which you want to put some flame retardants into a plastic. Why? Because a plastic is made out of hydrocarbons, and so it very easily catches fire. So, you might want to put some flame retardants into a plastic, especially in applications such as automotive seat covers. So, the seat cover that is there in your vehicle might be having a number of flame retardants. Now, that flame retardant is playing an important role when we are talking about the automobile safety. So, it should not very easily catch fire, but then once its life is over and once this seat cover gets into the ecosystem, what is the role of that flame retardant after that while? So, that flame retardant might act as a very toxic substance for the ecosystem. So, we have substances such as bisphenol A. Now, bisphenol A is used as a plasticizer. In the case of these plastic bottles, if you have this bisphenol A, so it will give you this amount of suppleness. So, if you are pressing it, it will come back to its original shape. Now, that is because of a plasticizer, which is bisphenol A, but then bisphenol A is also an endocrine disruptor. What it means is that the structure of this molecule is very similar to that of some hormones that are found in the body. Now, if you take some tadpoles, now tadpoles are the young ones of frogs, and if you take these tadpoles and you expose them to bisphenol A, they will all change their sex. Why? Because this substance bisphenol A, it is very similar in its structure and in its action to the sex hormones. So, then this might have an impact on the ecosystem. What happens if you have a pond and that pond has a huge concentration of bisphenol A, and all the tadpoles that are born in that particular pond, all of them are females, there is no male in that system. So, the whole ecosystem would collapse, because you will not have any more frogs in that ecosystem after a while, because there is no male to fertilize the females. Or if you talk about things like brominated flame retardants or BFRs, these are also bioaccumulative toxins. They get accumulated in the bodies, and they are also magnified when we move up the food chain. So, here we are observing that not only are these substances getting accumulated in the body, but then because all these organisms are part of some ecosystem, so they also play a big role in the working of the ecosystems. So, this is how the plastics are able to disrupt the ecosystems. Or let us talk about accumulation and concentration of hydrophobic toxins. So, there are a number of these chemicals. Now, if you have these chemicals, it is possible that some of them might be hydrophobic in their nature. Now, when we say a hydrophobic substance, hydro is water and phobic is fear of. So, you have hydrophobic, it means there is a toxic substance that hates water. So, in that case, the hydrophobic substances might come together. Now, where do you get a hydrophobic surface in nature? You have it in the form of waxes, or if there is another piece of plastic nearby. A plastic is a very hydrophobic surface. So, now what happens is, if you have these hydrophobic toxins that are there in the water, and if you put a piece of plastic here, these hydrophobic substances will come and adhere to the surface of the plastic. So, in that case, the concentration of the hydrophobic toxins increases a lot, and because of this, when they get ingested or when they get absorbed into the bodies of any organism, if they get ingested by say a plankton, so all of these hydrophobic toxins will now be able to exert a very big role in the bodies of these planktons. Another way in which plastics are harming the ecosystems is by their potential to alter the habitats and behaviors of organisms. So, we looked at this example of hermit crab. Now, if you have a hermit crab which is using a bottle cap as its shell, this is not a normal behavior of a hermit crab. So, you are changing the behaviors of organisms, and then when there is one organism that is changing its behavior, it might also have a cascading effect up and down in the food chain. Or let us look at the seahorse. Now, you have the seahorse that in place of using a twig is now using an earbud for its support. What will happen next? If there is an animal that feeds on seahorses, it might even feed on this earbud. Or let us talk about these hyenas. Now, these hyenas are there in a trash yard, and all they have around is plastics. Now, this is not a normal behavior. This is not something that a hyena is exposed to or should be exposed to in the normal course of life. We are observing these days, we are observing plastics even in the most pristine of environments. So, we went to the Manas Tiger Reserve, which is there in Assam, and in this tiger reserve, which also holds a very big rhinoceros population. So, we were moving around, and there we saw a pile of rhinoceros dung. Now, we prodded this dung because we were seeing some bits of plastics here, and lo and behold, we were able to find out this piece of polythene bag which was there in the rhinoceros dung. Now, if we have a polythene bag that is there in the rhinoceros dung, it means that the rhinoceros had actually fed on the polythene. And where did it get this polythene from? Because Manas Tiger Reserve is not an area that has a very big habitation nearby, and even then it was able to get hold of this polythene. So, these plastics, because they are light in weight, because they are able to get carried away by wind, by water and so on, they are even reaching our tiger reserves, which are some of the most pristine areas, some of the most protected areas that we have for the conservation of biodiversity. Another way in which plastics impact wildlife is by acting as dispersal agents, including transport of invasive species. Now, what is happening in this case is, suppose we have a situation in which this is your mainland and then there is an island here, and then all this area is water. Now, there will be some birds that will be able to move from the mainland to the island. There will be some small seeds or maybe some small insects that get flown along with wind into the island, but what about the larger animals? So, there might be some animals that can swim to the island, but then there are a number of other organisms that require some mode of transportation. So, for instance, suppose there was a coconut tree somewhere here, and then a piece of coconut fell into the water, and then maybe a frog jumped into this coconut, and then along with this coconut it was able to reach to this island. So, such instances of use of transportation materials is common in nature, but then when we are talking about naturally available substances that can act as transport materials, they are limited. Not only because we have a limited number of things that are naturally available and are able to float from point A to point B, but at the same time also because all of these natural materials are also biodegradable. So, for larger distances you require those materials that should not biodegrade while during the process of transportation. Now, if there is this coconut and if this island is very far from the mainland, then it is possible that by the natural process of degradation, this coconut will end its structure here, and so the organism will not be able to reach the island. So, nature has its own ways to limit, to facilitate the movement of organisms from one place to another, and also to limit the movement of organisms from one place to another. Now, how are plastics influencing this? If in place of this coconut there was a piece of plastic that was floating, and if an animal gets on top of this plastic, so this plastic is not going to biodegrade when it is being transported from one place to another. So, in most instances this organism that jumped onto the plastic will be able to reach the island. And if we look at the organisms that are being transported because of these plastics, here these colored entities are the natural materials. So, these are the natural materials like wood or metal or tar balls or some other materials, and all of these darkened bars represent the plastics. And here we are observing how many number of species of all these different taxonomic groups are able to move from one place to another, and what proportion of it is using the natural materials and what proportion of it is using the plastics. Now, in the case of some organisms such as the bryozoans, here we can observe that the natural movement is very small, but just because you have so many plastic materials around, so these animals are able to move from one place to another place. Now, why is that important for us? Well, that is important because there could be a number of species that are invasive species. So, if you have an organism that shifted from this mainland, used this plastic and was able to reach the island, probably it would cause a havoc to this island, because this organism is an invasive species. It establishes itself on this island and it is able to outcompete all the other organisms that are there on this island. So, these are the kinds of ecosystem impacts that we can foresee. Or probably there is an organism that is a pathogenic organism, or an organism that is say a predator organism, and there is this island that does not have any naturally occurring predators or maybe a limited number of predators, and when this organism comes to the island, it is able to eat away all the birds of this island. So, that might result in the collapse of the whole ecosystem of the island, which is also another way in which plastics are impacting the ecosystems. Now, if we look at the hierarchy of things, we can see that there is an impact of plastics. Even the impacts of microplastics can be observed throughout the hierarchy. So, if we look at, so here these are subcellular level, cellular level, organ, individual, population and ecosystem, and we are talking about the impacts of microplastics. Now, microplastics can be ingested, they can be eaten up, or they can be there can be an uptake across the membranes of some organisms, or they can be a release of co-contaminants that are there along with these microplastics, and we are seeing the impacts of all of these. Now, at the subcellular level, because of these chemicals that are being released, you can have changes in the enzymatic activity or changes in gene expression or oxidative damage to the cells. At the level of cellular structures, we can observe apoptosis. Now, apoptosis is a process in which a cell performs a suicide. So, it is a programmed cell death that we observe in a number of cells. So, what is happening in this case is that you have this microplastic that was able to get into these cells, it was able to influence the subcellular structures, it was able to cause some damage to the cell, and because of this damage the cell committed a cell death, which is apoptosis. Or you can see a change in the membrane stability of the cell, or changes in the phagocytic responses of the cell. Now, phagocytic response, phagocytic means that the cell is eating up some other organism for food, and in this case a change in the phagocytic response would mean that by eating up this plastic, now this cell is no more able to eat or to show its phagocytic response. At the level of organs, we can observe histopathology. Histo is tissue and pathology is a disease state. So, here we are observing histopathology, or a change in the metabolic demand of the organs, or a change in the energetic reserves of the organism. At the level of individual, we can see mortality. So, we have seen so many organisms that die because of these plastics. So, we can have changes in mortality, changes in ingestion rates. Ingestion rates, why? Because the alimentary canal of this organism is now full of microplastics. So, there is not enough space. So, this organism is always getting a feeling of fullness, but then it is not getting any nutrients. Or there can be changes in the individual growth because the organism is not getting enough nutrients. At the level of population, if there is changes in the level of individuals, we will also observe changes in the level of population. So, there can be changes in fecundity or the birth rates, or we can have changes in offspring viability, or changes in larval development. Now, here again, as we have seen, even in the case of larger sized plastics, there can be changes in the viability of the offsprings, like in the case of the albatross chick. So, the albatross chick died because its alimentary canal was all full of plastics. We can also see the same impact in the case of smaller organisms as well. So, from the population level changes, we can also observe ecosystem level changes in the behavior of organisms. So, we saw in the case of larger organisms like the hermit crab, there was a change in the behavior because now this hermit crab was using a plastic bottle cap as its shell, and the same a very similar thing can also be seen in a number of other organisms as well. There can be changes in ecosystem service in ecosystem functions and community shifts. So, essentially even a very small thing like a microplastic can have impacts all over in the ecosystem. Now that we know that plastics cause a deleterious impact and even microplastics cause a deleterious impact, what are the options available for us? How can we help? So, the first way we can help is to reduce our requirements of plastics, to reuse the plastics and to recycle plastics. So, when we say to reduce our demand of plastics, if we have an option available, whether you should go for a plastic straw or whether you should go for a glass when you want to drink a soft drink. So, you can go for a lifestyle change. You can say that in place of using a straw, you would prefer having the soft drink either directly from the bottle or say in a glass. So, in that way you would reduce your demand for straws. Reuse. When we say reuse, if you have to use a plastic bottle, why not fill it up again? So, in that case you will reuse the plastic bottle and again reduce the demand, and at the end of its life cycle the plastic should be put through a recycling process. So, in the case of recycling, you have all these plastics that are then clumped together in the form of these big bundles, and then they are reheated, they are remelted, and then they are converted into some other products. So, reduce, reuse, recycle, lifestyle changes, glasses in place of straws, and use of alternative materials like bioplastics. Now, bioplastics are biodegradable plastics. So, unlike the petroleum based plastics that we see all around us, these are those plastics that have the properties of the plastics, but they are at the same time they are biodegradable. In most cases, these are made out of biological macromolecules. So, for instance, when we talk about normal plastic, when we say talk about polyethylene, now polyethylene is made out of long polymer chains that are made by polymerizing the ethylene molecules. Now, in place of those long chains, because these long chains are giving the properties of to the plastic, we can make use of some other biologically available polymers. So, those polymers could be things such as carbohydrates. So, you can make use of chains of carbohydrates, or you can make use of chains of proteins. So, these plastics, when they are made out of these biological polymers, would give you the properties of the plastics, but at the same time they will also be biodegradable. So, we created some biodegradable plastics at IIT Kanpur, and here we can observe that this is an agarose based bioplastic material. It is completely transparent, it is completely flexible, so you can roll it up just like any other piece of polyethylene sheet, and also the strength of this plastic is much greater than that of many of the existing plastic materials, existing petroleum based plastic materials. So, when we talk about low density polyethylene, this is the strength of low density polyethylene. This is that of polytetrafluoroethylene. Here we have the strength of the normal bioplastic. So, the normal bioplastic is already somewhere like twice the strength of the low density polyethylene. Now, this is the strength of high density polyethylene, which is a bit greater than that of the bioplastic, but then we can tinker the bioplastic by using some composite materials to increase its strength, so that it becomes even greater than that of the high density polyethylene. Here we have PVC, the polyvinyl chloride, and then we can use some other composites, so that the strength of the bioplastic is even greater than that of the PVC and is actually approaching the levels of nylon, which is one of the most high strength plastics that we have around. So, in this lecture we began by looking at the impacts of large infrequent disturbances on different ecosystems or different communities. So, that was a revision in which we saw that if there is any community or any ecosystem that is not in the most normal state, but is already a bit altered, already a bit stressed. So, any large infrequent disturbance might lead to a collapse of that ecosystem. Now, one of those stressors that are available today is plastics. So, we looked at plastics, we began with the definition of plastics, went through a short history of when plastics were manufactured, how are they manufactured, how much amount of plastics is being manufactured, how its production is increasing 5% every year, and then we looked at the impacts of plastics on the ecosystem. So, we saw the impacts of different sizes of plastics, the macro debris, the meso debris and the micro debris. The impacts that they cause are things such as ingestion impacts, in which animals eat them and then they get lodged into the intestines, and then the organism dies out of malnutrition, or things like smothering. So, if there is a sheet of plastic that has come and attached itself to the mouth parts of an organism, so this organism is now no more able to feed, or it is no more able to respire because it has clogged the airways. So, that is the impact of smothering. We looked at the impact of ghost nets. So, there is an animal that gets entrapped here and this animal is now no more able to move, or things that are acting at a smaller scale. So, there are a number of chemicals that these plastics are releasing, which were earlier used as plasticizers or as flame retardants, and after the usage of plastics they are now becoming a nuisance toxic molecule when they are there in the ecosystem. We also looked at microplastics. So, in the case of these micro debris or microplastics or microfibers, we saw that how these particles are now able to reach to all the organisms by getting into the food chain. So, they enter into the bodies of the planktons, and from the planktons they get eaten up by other organisms, and then slowly and steadily all the organisms get exposed to these plastics. We also saw that even in the case of the bottom dwelling organisms, these plastics are able to reach even to the bottom of the seas and oceans in the form of marine snow, in the form of other aggregates, in the form of fecal pellets and so on, and they are even seen in those organisms that are found at the bottom of the ocean, such as the sea pen. And then we also looked at how these organisms are how various organisms are using plastics to transport themselves from one place to another, how it is causing a change in the behaviors of organisms, how it is even reaching our most pristine locations such as tiger reserves. And then we looked at various ways in which we can reduce these impacts by reducing our usage, by reducing the demand, by reusing these plastics, by recycling these plastics, or by shifting to other materials such as biodegradable plastics. So, these materials have the good properties of plastics, but at the same time they are also biodegradable, so that they do not cause this havoc to the ecosystem. If there is an organism that eats up a piece of bioplastic, so because it is made out of carbohydrates, this bioplastic will get digested in its alimentary canal. It will only provide nutrition to this organism, it will not occlude the intestines of the organism. If you burn a bioplastic, it will only release carbon dioxide and water, there is no dioxins that is going to be released. And if these plastics are just left out into the environment, a number of decomposers will start acting on these. So, we will have the action of bacteria, we will have the action of a number of fungi, which will then biodegrade these plastics into their elements, and which will then become a part of the food chain without causing any of the negative consequences. So, that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.